So sacrifice becomes the foundation of the state, not power, not hedonism, sacrifice. And then that motif is played out through the whole Bible, and that's what culminates in the New Testament, right? Total sacrifice as the foundation of the community. And that's right.
Jordan Peterson recently joined Joe Rogan on his podcast, where they explored powerful insights that resonate deeply with Christians. Among the topics discussed, Peterson reflects on how to live as a good man in accordance with God's laws. Let's dive into this profound conversation and reflect on its meaning.
The story that comes up at the beginning of Moses when he turns into a leader. So it's about how you turn into a leader. Okay, so he's already killed a man and he's left Egypt because of it. So now he's in this land called Midian, and he goes there and he chases some ruffians away from a well for these two girls who are drawing water. And they go and tell their father, and he says to them, bring this young man home to have dinner. So he does, and then he gets married to them. And then he becomes a shepherd. And this is crucial because the shepherd's an image that runs through the biblical corpus, right? Shepherds at that time lived by themselves in the wilderness on their wits, and they kept the wolves and the lions at bay with primitive weapons. So these were tough guys. And they cared for the most vulnerable. So a shepherd is an image of optimized ordinary masculinity. You take care of yourself, you can keep the monsters at bay, and you attend to the most vulnerable. So Moses has got that. He's a shepherd. He's a successful shepherd. So now he's out there one day wandering around Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, that's the place where heaven and earth touch. So that's where the messengers of the divine descend to earth. And so he's out there and something attracts his attention, makes him curious. That's the burning bush. It's not a forest fire. It's not something you can't ignore. It's something alive, because that's a bush. A tree is a symbol of life. And it's burning because things that are alive burn, right? That's metabolism. And an intensification of that, like a psychedelic intensification of that, that's what the burning bush is.
Moses, once a shepherd in the wilderness, encounters the burning bush, a divine calling that compels him to step out of his comfort zone. This mirrors our own journeys when God calls us to step into a higher purpose, often when we least expect it. As Christians, we are reminded that God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. Sometimes our greatest transformation happens when we respond to God's invitation, just as Moses did.
And that's what glimmers to Moses. And he steps off the beaten track, right, to investigate what drives his curiosity. And so then he goes off the beaten track and he starts to delve deeply into the mysteries of the burning bush. And at some point he realizes he's on sacred ground. He takes off his shoes. That's a symbol of willingness to transform identity, because shoes signify identity, right? They're part of your costume, your working man's costume. And so then he continues to commune with the burning bush. He gets deeper and deeper into something. He makes himself a specialist by following what compels him and delving deeply into it. And when he gets deep enough into it, to the bottom, the voice of eternity speaks to him and says, you're now no longer who you were. You're now a leader. You have to go back to your people. You have to stand up against the tyrant. You have to tell the slaves that they need to leave their tyranny and their slavery and serve me in the wilderness. And you have to do that now. And Moses says, I can't, because I can't speak. I'm slow of tongue. And God says, basically, that's your problem. And with me on your side, we can sort that out. And don't you have a brother, Aaron? And can't he speak? It's like, bring him along for the ride. And so that's when Moses becomes a leader, right? And so that's the pattern. It's like ordinary masculinity. Those are the dwarves that Snow White serves before she meets the prince, by the way, the ordinary masculine, right?
Here, Moses hesitates to accept God's call, citing his inability to speak. But God reassures him, emphasizing that with his help, anything is possible. This moment teaches us a powerful lesson about humility. As Christians, we can often feel inadequate, but God calls us to trust Him even when we feel weak or unqualified. It's not about our own strength, but about God's power working through us.
And those dwarves protect her from the evil queen that wants to suppress her by feeding her a poisoned apple. So Snow White has to learn to serve the ordinary man before she can find a prince. Yeah, something Disney missed completely in the last story. So what's the pattern? Well, you discipline yourself so you become a shepherd, and then you follow what compels you off the path. Then you take it seriously and get to the bottom of it, and then that transforms you. And thus transformed, you can face the tyrant. You can specify the promised land properly, and you can lead the slaves across chaos and blood, that's the Red Sea, and then through the desert. Right? And so you said two things. You said that the good fighters have learned to integrate their civilized side, otherwise they don't get to be great, and that they continue the pathway of self-improvement, right? They continue to pursue what's calling to them. That's another definition of God in the Old Testament, by the way. What calls to you? That's the burning bush. The spirit of the burning bush is what entices you, what grabs your interest, what attracts your curiosity. And that's identical. The biblical claim is that's the same thing as the spirit of adventure. It's the same thing that speaks to Noah. Noah's a good man. And a voice comes to him and says, all hell's about to break loose. And he believes his intuition because he's a good man and can rely on himself. So he makes the ark, right? And he brings his family aboard, and culture and nature, and reestablishes humanity. That's the pathway of the leader too.
What is your take on, there's a university in Jerusalem that had this theory that the burning bush was the acacia bush. And the acacia bush is rich in DMT.
Well, I think, I think that hallucinogens strip memory from perception. So you see the world in all its blazing glory. Huxley figured that out with the doors of perception. That is apparently what psychedelics do psychopharmacologically. They mimic a high-stress condition, and they strip memory from perception so that you can return to the source and revitalize your perceptions. Right, so the probability that there's some overlap between that and the burning bush is high. It's high, so to speak. High. Yeah. So I'll tell you one more thing, one more story, okay, if that's all right with you. So something else I figured out that I tried on Brett. So imagine you take the hedonistic path, you can take the power path, you can take the nihilistic path. Okay, and then you might say, well, that's the only three options. That's kind of what the postmodernists believe. That's kind of what the nihilists and the postmodernists, the Nietzscheans believe. Power, hedonism, nihilism, those are your options. There's no uniting narrative above that. Okay, so in the story of Cain and Abel, two patterns are laid out that are different than that. One is Cain's pattern, one's Abel's pattern. So these are the first two people that live in the world, right? Because Adam and Eve are made by God. They're in paradise or were. Cain and Abel are the first two people. So Abel brings his best to the table. So he takes the best animal in his flock, and he takes the best cut and the best part of the cut, and he offers that to God. So he literally brings his best to the table. That's what he sacrifices. And Cain doesn't. So Cain's sacrifices are rejected by God. And God tells him, if you brought your best to the table, you'd be accepted. And Cain gets bitter and resentful and invites temptation in to possess him. So that spirit of resentment possesses him, and then he becomes murderous. He kills his brother, and his descendants become genocidal, and then you have the flood.
In this segment, Peterson discusses the sacrifice of Abel versus that of Cain. Abel offers his best to God, while Cain holds back. This story speaks directly to the heart of Christian faith, giving God our best, whether it's our time, our talents, or our sacrifices. Are we offering God the best of ourselves, or are we withholding what He truly deserves? True worship is not about quantity, but the quality of our heart's offering.
And so that pattern of sacrifice is established right at the beginning of the biblical texts. Abel versus Cain. Abel brings the best to the table, and that satisfies God. So one question, God actually asks Cain this when Cain complains. He says, wouldn't you be accepted if you were doing your best? So that's a question of conscience, right? If you're in extreme misery and your life is hollow and empty and you're bitter and resentful, it's like, you bringing your best to the table? Because the covenant proclaims that if you did, you'd be accepted.
Yeah,
So,
clearly.
okay, so now the question is, what constitutes, now you have to sacrifice. So sacrifice becomes the foundation of the state, not power, not hedonism, it's sacrifice. And then that motif is played out through the whole Bible, and that's what culminates in the New Testament, right? Total sacrifice as the foundation of the community. And that's right. And I don't know what sense to make out of the metaphysics of the religious realm, because that's beyond me and everyone. The world's a strange place, and we could leave it at that. But the idea that, see, Christ is the exemplar of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? Won't turn to power, won't deviate from his course, faces the worst of all possible deaths, descends to hell itself. That's the pattern of life lived with no reserve. And that's the foundation of the free state. That's right. I tried that on Brett, eh? He told me when we first met on the tour that he felt that the biblical narratives were anachronistic, that they were written in a time that was no longer relevant to us. But he decided by the end of our 3 days together that if you got to the core of the message, it's alive, right? That's the living spirit inside the bush, you might say.
Right.
And that so here's even the weirder thing. So imagine, it's pretty obvious that Christ is a symbol of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? I don't think it doesn't really come as a shock to anyone. But the weird thing is, we put that symbol at the center of our churches and at the centers of our towns for 2,000 years, not really knowing why. And the reason is that voluntary self-sacrifice is the foundation of the integrated psyche and the stable, productive, and abundant community. And that's right. It's right. And so, well, it's been exciting to have the opportunity over the last 9 months to go talk to people about it, because I've talked to about 150,000 people, I guess, public lectures.
That to me is one of the most fascinating aspects of Christianity, regardless of whether or not you think logically these things took place. Logically, these stories are a completely accurate depiction of exactly how it went. If you follow the principles, it's incredibly beneficial to your spiritual life as a person.
Well, that's a kind of interesting proof, isn't it? Because it means that
there's truth in it.
Well, there's certainly the spirit that makes, what would you say? The spirit of truth that makes life more abundant. That's exactly right. And these are weird stories because the way they're true is very sophisticated. They're true always. And that's different than a story about the past. Like, the truest story is always happening. The story of Moses is exactly like that. Like the pattern of leadership development that's embedded in the Exodus story, that is how leaders develop, if they're real leaders. And their temptation is power, but that's not their motivation. That's their temptation, right? That's a very important distinction. And that's always the case with leaders. And if they fall prey to the temptation of power, no matter what their accomplishments, they're not going to complete the task.
Right.
And so there's a cool element at the end of that story too. When Moses, just before Moses dies, he picks a scout from each tribe, 12 tribes, and he sends them to Canaan, which is the future. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's the potential place we could reside where everything was worked out, the land of milk and honey. He sends 12 scouts there. And 10 of them come back and say, they tell a fear story. Say it's insurmountable, the challenges that lie ahead of us. There's no way we can master this. We should have never crossed the desert. We should have stayed under the thumbs of the tyrants. We should have never tried to be anything more than slaves, because now we're doomed. And 2 of them say, no, if we maintain our upward orientation and our covenant, nothing can stand in our way. We can make the deserts bloom. Moses dies, those 2 scouts, and so do all the Israelites who are convinced by the unfaithful scouts. And the scouts die, and the 2 people who go on to the promised land are Caleb and Joshua. And they lead the Israelites, the faithful Israelites, into the promised land. Those are the people who have the courage to confront the future in a faithful and, what would you say, faithful, hopeful, and courageous manner. They're the inheritors of the future. Caleb, Joshua. Joshua's name is the same as Christ's name. It's the same name. And that's not fluke, right? That's one of those echoes or precursors to the story.
Mm.
There's an ethos that leads you into the promised land. And what's the ethos? The spirit of voluntary self-sacrifice. You know, you give up something for a social relationship. Of course, you give up being primary, right? You do the same thing at the social level. And when you do that, it integrates you and it sets the world straight. And that's built into the biblical story. It's right at its core.
As we've listened to this insightful conversation between Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, there are powerful themes that align deeply with Christian teachings. At its core, this conversation is about transformation, leadership, humility, sacrifice, and our purpose in God's plan. We began with Moses, a man who started as an ordinary shepherd but was called by God to be a leader. The burning bush, which caught Moses' attention, was a symbol of God's divine call to action. In the Bible, we see that Moses was not seeking greatness, but God called him to lead his people out of slavery. This act of divine calling is a reminder for us all. God often calls us from where we are, no matter how ordinary we may feel. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, God calls Moses by name, showing that he has a specific purpose for each one of us. Like Moses, we may be hesitant, uncertain of our abilities, or feel unworthy, but God's purpose is greater than our limitations. As Peterson said, God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. Then, we reflect on Moses' hesitation to lead because he felt unqualified. He doubted his own abilities, especially his speaking skills, but God reassured him that He would be with him every step of the way. This is a powerful lesson in humility. We are reminded that our weaknesses do not disqualify us from God's calling. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, the Apostle Paul teaches us, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" God's strength is made perfect when we are humble and rely on Him, not our own abilities. The conversation also delved into the story of Cain and Abel, the first two brothers who brought offerings to God. Abel's offering was accepted because it was his best, while Cain's offering was not, as he gave less than his best. This story is a reminder that God desires our best, whether it's in our actions, our work, or our worship. Malachi chapter 1 verse 8 calls us to offer our best. When you offer blind animals for sacrifice, is that not wrong? When you offer lame or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Our sacrifices should reflect our love and devotion to God. He calls us to offer our best, not our leftovers. Lastly, Peterson reflects on the path of a leader, discussing how Moses, after accepting God's call, led his people through great adversity. He faced the challenge of leading a people who doubted him, just as many leaders face skepticism and resistance. This reminds us of Christ's leadership, a leader who sacrificed himself for the good of humanity. As Matthew chapter 20, verses 26 to 28 tells us, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." True leadership, according to God's will, is not about power or fame, but about self-sacrifice and service to others. In this conversation, we learn that the true essence of leadership and following God's call involves stepping out in faith, offering our best to Him, and leading with humility and sacrifice. These are timeless lessons that have guided generations, and they remain relevant today. Let us reflect on Moses' journey as a reminder that God calls us, equips us, and leads us to fulfill His purpose. Just as He was with Moses in the wilderness, He will be with us, guiding us through life's challenges, if we trust in His plan and offer our best to Him. If you found this conversation inspiring, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who may need this message today. Subscribe to the channel for more content on faith, leadership, and the teachings of God. And let us know in the comments what part of the conversation spoke most to your heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Remember, the journey of faith is a lifelong adventure, and God is always calling us to move forward in His strength. Stay faithful, stay courageous, and always offer your best to God. Thanks for watching, and God bless.